Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Elise Labott in Washington, and we begin this Memorial Day with the latest developments in the war against Iran and the status of peace talks, which President Trump claimed over the weekend were largely finished, but then seemingly backtracked, muddying the picture of where things stand, all while purported details of an emerging agreement have alarmed some White House allies. This morning, President Trump participated in a wreath-laying ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in commemoration of Memorial Day. The president then delivered remarks honoring the U.S. service members who gave their lives for this country, including the 13 U.S. troops who have died during the war with Iran.
This Memorial Day, we salute them, we exalt them, and we thank them for all that we have and for all that they gave. They gave everything. In Operation Epic Fury, we lost 13 wonderful souls, wonderful, special people. These incredible men and women gave their lives to ensure that the world's #1 state sponsor of terror will never have a nuclear weapon. Oh, and they won't. They will never have a nuclear weapon. I'm sure you know that.
It comes after the president spent the weekend at the White House trying to push a deal with Iran over the finish line while providing updates via social media. On Saturday, saying an agreement has been largely negotiated, subject to finalization between the U.S. and Iran, the details of which would be announced shortly. Then Sunday morning, saying negotiations are proceeding in an orderly and constructive manner, but adding that he will not rush into a deal. But by Sunday evening, posting if he makes a deal with Iran, it will be, quote, good and proper, and then going on to say the deal isn't even fully negotiated yet. And this morning saying it will only be a great deal for all or no deal at all, while also demanding Gulf countries sign on to a separate deal to normalize relations with Israel. Speaking during a joint press conference in India yesterday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio said significant progress was being made, while reiterating the administration's red line.
The ultimate goal is that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. Iran can never possess a nuclear weapon. The president has been clear about that. They will never possess a nuclear weapon, certainly not as long as Donald Trump is president of the United States. And it will require some future work on negotiating the details. When you're talking about a nuclear program, as an example, these are highly technical matters and ones that would probably need to be addressed over some period of time.
Today, Iran is also making clear its red lines, saying any agreement to end the war must include the release of billions of dollars of Iran's frozen assets, the lifting of the U.S. naval blockade, and the end of the war between Israel and Lebanon. Tehran also making no commitments about its nuclear program or its stockpiles of highly enriched uranium. Oil prices, however, are rapidly falling on renewed hopes for a deal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Right now, prices per barrel are at $90, down from around $105 just a few days ago. Joining me now is NBC News Chief White House Correspondent Garrett Haake. NBC News international correspondent Raf Sanchez is in Doha. And also with me is NBC News business and economy reporter Allie Canal. Thank you all so much for joining us on this Memorial Day. Garrett, I do want to start with you over at the White House. Are we getting any clarity on what is in the deal with Iran and just how close the two sides are to a final deal?
Well, Nell, to hear the Secretary of State describe it, we're essentially waiting for the Iranians to respond to the proposal here to basically punt the hard decisions out to a 60-day negotiating window, according to a senior administration official, and lift the economic pressure that exists on both sides by ending these mutual blockades of the Strait of Hormuz. But if all of this sounds to viewers like deja vu all over again, I think that's fair. We have been in this position before where a lot of what appeared to have been momentum towards some kind of deal or memorandum of understanding or one-page framework to keep the conversation going has ultimately fallen apart. What seems different about this time is the weight of some of the other regional players who've gotten involved, and I think the president's willingness, at least based on his Truth Social posts, to truly take some of the nuclear issues that were the crux of this whole conflict from the jump and push that discussion further out to reopen the strait now and talk about the big stuff later.
And Garrett, one of the things I mentioned is that Tehran is demanding the release of frozen Iranian assets. Is that something this president is willing to concede on, especially given that he attacked President Obama for doing that as part of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal?
Yeah, blasting the President Obama over this has been sort of a key talking point for President Trump across two terms in the White House. I think if the administration could find a way to unfreeze some of these funds in a way that don't come from American banks. Some of this money, for example, is frozen in Qatar, where the Iranians have been engaged in some recent conversations. That might be the kind of thing that allows the president to basically look the other way politically while this happens. But he's going to be accused of hypocrisy by some either on the left or on the right, or possibly both, no matter really how this deal shakes out. We've started to see some of that already, particularly from some of his critics who felt emboldened on the Republican side to basically say that they don't really understand the elements of this deal, even the few that have been outlined by the administration so far.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that Republican criticism that you mentioned, because over the weekend he got some pushback from some of his own typical allies, including Senator Lindsey Graham, also Roger Wicker, both of them questioning some of the reported details of the deal. So how much do you think that the president is actually listening to the concerns of members in his own party?
Well, I suppose that here I would point to the difference between hearing and listening. He's definitely hearing it. He's been responding pretty aggressively on social media. He is aware of the criticism. Whether it's ultimately affecting his decision-making process is another matter. And it's important to note he's basically getting two sets of criticism here from folks like Graham and Wicker, who you pointed out, who are saying that the point of this was to go really destroy the Iranian nuclear program, significantly set back their missile program. That work, they believe, has not been done. He has other critics in that caucus of defeated or retiring Republican lawmakers who've questioned other elements of this deal or even the Iran strategy more broadly. I don't know how he satisfies all of them and still extricates himself from this situation. I think that's part of the reason you've seen such delay and this sort of strategy of constantly extending the timeline on these talks, looking for a Goldilocks solution that may not exist.
Garrett, thank you so much for breaking all of that down. Raf, I want to get over to you. You're in Doha right now. That's where Iran's top negotiator is. So what do you know about those meetings, and what are Iranian officials saying about what is or is not in this deal?
Yeah, Melanie, so we have the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament. We have Iran's foreign minister here in Doha right now. These are Iran's top two negotiators. It is notable that they are here in the Gulf. Up until this point, Pakistan has been the main mediator between Iran and the United States. But in the last couple of days, we've seen Qatar really stepping up, really trying to get this deal over the line. The Iranians are saying that there is agreement in large parts, but that a final deal at this stage is not imminent. They say that they need final approval from their supreme leader, who, of course, is the ultimate decision maker inside of the Iranian system. Why are these senior Iranian officials here in Qatar? Garrett mentioned one of the tricky things in this first stage of the deal is the Iranians are looking to have some of their money unfrozen. They're looking for sanctions relief. The United States is saying they're going to have to make big concessions before they get any of that. One way potentially to square that circle is if the money released to Iran does not come from the United States, instead it potentially comes from somewhere like Qatar. It could possibly be dressed up as a humanitarian loan instead of direct handing over of cash, something that President Trump is so eager to avoid. So it does seem that that is one of the many, many things being discussed here in the Gulf tonight. Melanie.
Yeah, you mentioned some of those sticking points. Another major sticking point in these negotiations is the conflict between Israel and Lebanon. Would Israel abide by a peace deal if it included ending that conflict?
Yeah, so we are seeing Lebanon become a major, major complicating factor in this. The Israelis are absolutely adamant that they are going to continue their attacks inside of Lebanon aimed at Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed militant group. We heard from the Israeli Prime Minister tonight that they are intensifying those strikes. On the other side, you have the Iranians saying that this deal has to end the fighting on all fronts, and that includes in Lebanon. So far from the administration, we have seen them somewhat trying to walk the line on this. Secretary of State Rubio in India earlier was asked about what was going to happen in Lebanon. He said the Israelis, of course, would retain the right to self-defense. But does that mean that they can keep their forces inside Lebanon? Does it mean that they can continue airstrikes against the Lebanese capital? That's going to be one of the tricky issues to resolve here. Mel.
And Raf, this morning, President Trump seemed to suggest that as part of the Iran talks, that Gulf nations will need to also sign the Abraham Accords, which would normalize relations with Israel. Would those Gulf countries be willing to take that step?
The short answer is no. The view here in the Gulf is that these are separate issues. Ending the war with Iran is one thing. It is a big priority for the Gulf countries. Getting the Strait of Hormuz open, big priority. Making peace with Israel, they see as a totally separate track. The position of Qatar, the position of Saudi Arabia is there needs to be at minimum a pathway to a Palestinian state for that discussion to happen. At this point, that does not look on even the far horizon, let alone the near horizon. It's not totally clear why President Trump added this new complicating factor to what is already an extremely complicated negotiation. The Abraham Accords, one of the signature foreign policy achievements of his first term. He has been eager to expand it in his second term, especially to normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But also, you were discussing with Garrett, the president is taking a lot of political heat from Republican hawks like Lindsey Graham, who are extremely pro-Israel. And it may be that he thinks he can sell this deal with Iran a little more easily to those constituencies if he can pair it to some kind of advantage to Israel, like an expansion of the Abraham Accords. No.
Yeah, no doubt. Raf, thank you so much for all of that reporting in the region. I want to turn to the business side of this with Allie Canal. Transit through the Strait of Hormuz remains significantly lower than its pre-war levels. But how are oil markets reacting to this latest news about the Iran negotiations?
Yeah, well, they're reacting positively. We're seeing U.S. crude trade just around $90 a barrel. For the past few weeks, we were hovering at around $100 a barrel. So that $10 to $15 drop is pretty significant here. But I will say that oil markets are pretty volatile. There are still a lot of questions when it comes to the details of this potential peace negotiation. Will Iran continue to control the Strait of Hormuz? There's a lot that we still don't know. And also, even if the Strait of Hormuz were to reopen tomorrow, it is going to take months for ships to resume their normal flows, to rebuild schedules, to decide which vessel moves at which time. Remember, there are still 1,500 oil tankers that have just been idle in the Persian Gulf. So that is going to take some time. There's also likely still going to be some fear of retaliation, particularly around the security threats within the Strait of Hormuz. Are there still those sea mines? All those questions are going to be running through the minds of these insurance companies as well as these shipping companies at the same time. Now, analysts have also told me that we could potentially see a floor to oil prices because a lot of these energy companies have depleted their reserves. So they might want to rebuild those stockpiles since we lost a lot of oil that were sitting on those ships over the past 3 months here since the war began. So a lot of question marks still to come.
Real quick, Allie, does a drop in oil prices mean consumers should expect prices at the pump to fall anytime soon?
Yeah, well, oil and gas very closely correlated. If we see a drop in oil, we're likely going to see a drop in gas prices. But again, because oil is expected to remain elevated in the near term, even if we are trading at $80 to $90 a barrel, prior to the war starting, oil was closer to $67 a barrel. Gas was below $3 a barrel because of that. So I don't think we're going to get back to sub $3 gas anytime soon. But hopefully things start to improve from here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Allie Canal. Joining me now is Elise Labott, host of the Cosmopolitics podcast. Thank you so much for joining us here to break this all down. The president really seemed optimistic on Saturday about the prospect of a deal, saying it would be, quote, announced shortly, before then pulling back and saying he's not going to rush into anything. It was quite the whipsaw over the weekend. So what do you make of his backtrack?
Well, the Iranians say that they haven't fully agreed because, as Garrett said, they're waiting for, and Ralph said they're waiting for word from the supreme leader. It looks as if, for Iran's case, the deal is very heavily tilted in Iran's favor, Melanie. I think President Trump has heard, as you know, some backlash from Republican senators, also on the left. So I think they're ready to go. I think he's at least saying right now that he's not ready to announce it. He's saying take their time. But I think it's mostly coming from, the Iranians. I think President Trump's ready to put this in his rearview mirror.
No doubt. The president has also stated repeatedly over the last month that a deal hasn't come together yet because it was unclear who was in charge in Iran. So is it clear now who the U.S. is negotiating with? And do they actually have the power in Iran to enforce whatever their side of an agreement might be looking like?
Look, I think that's kind of been a little bit, oversold, the idea that they don't know who's running Iran. Yes, there is a lot of, chaos in the regime since the killing of the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. But there is, a committee, if you will, about 5 or 6 leaders, some in the IRG, some clerics, the Speaker of the Parliament, Ghalibaf, and then there's the Supreme Leader. So everyone kind of comes together in consensus, and ultimately the Supreme Leader has the say. It's really just whether the Iranians feel that they have the terms to come to the table and make a deal. I think it's really up to the Iranians right now. It's pretty clear that the U.S. Is ready to make a deal. The Iranians just thought if they could survive, and they have, that they can frame this as a win. And when we hear about what's in the deal, which is a lot of lifting of the sanctions, a lot of unfreezing of assets, lifting of the blockade. Yes, they would have to open the Strait of Hormuz, but the nuclear deal, they've pushed it till after everything is settled with, the maritime traffic. And so the Iranians are really masters at dragging these negotiations out. So everything is really kind of front-loaded for the Iranians in terms of demining the strait, opening up the Strait of Hormuz. They really don't have to do anything until they get some of those things. It's really once those 60-day negotiations start for an actual nuclear deal, it's going to get more complicated. And if you remember, the nuclear deal that the Obama administration signed with the Iranians took 2 years to negotiate. So once that maritime traffic opens and once some sanctions are lifted and assets are unfrozen, I think these negotiations are going to drag out a bit.
Yeah, you mentioned the deal that was struck underneath President Obama. And based on what we're hearing, this deal could actually end up looking pretty similar to that Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, that was negotiated under Obama, which President Trump has criticized for providing Iran with sanctions relief. Do you think sanctions relief, though, is sort of inevitable as part of these negotiations?
Once you kind of go down that road and you release some of the assets and you lift some of the sanctions to get some of the concessions from Iran, it's really hard to put the genie back in the bottle. Ultimately, Iran's not going to get everything until it suspends its nuclear program, until it hands over that highly enriched uranium. The Iranians have shown some signal that they're willing to do that. They may not hand over everything. Maybe they'll do it to a third country, such as Russia, which has been discussed over the last few years. But I think, the Iranian economy is really in shambles. The Iranian regime knows it has to do something. This situation isn't sustainable for the Iranians as well as the world economy. So I think once you get this initial kind of ceasefire in place where the Strait of Hormuz opens, yeah, that deal is going to look very much like that JCPOA. There's a little bit of question as to how many years would be a moratorium on Iranian enrichment. The original deal was 15 years. The Trump administration is looking for 20. The Iranians were looking for 5. I think they'll probably come somewhere in the middle. And so, yeah, that deal is going to look a lot like the JCPOA. Of course, President Trump will find a way to frame it as a victory for him, and the Iranians will find a way to frame it as a victory for themselves. But as we said, the deal is pretty heavily tilted right now in the Iranians' favor.
Elise Labott, thank you so much for your insight and analysis. We really appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.